when people have feelings, as we all do, sometimes those feelings are memories. They're feeling or implicit memories. Sometimes they're a spontaneous reaction to whatever's happening. And sometimes those feelings could be the feeling of part of us. You know, and so it's really interesting because you have a feeling and you say, well, so-and-so or such and such made me feel that way. We don't say, oh, is this a feeling memory? Right? It never occurs to us.
Welcome to the MindHealth360 Show. I'm Kirkland Newman, and if you, your loved ones, or clients suffer from mental health issues such as depression, anxiety, insomnia, poor memory, poor attention, mood swings, exhaustion, etc., I interview the leading integrative mental health practitioners from around the world to help you understand the root causes of these symptoms, many of which may surprise you and suggest solutions to help you heal. If you like this interview, please do subscribe and forward to others who might find it helpful. If you want further information, please go to www.mindhealth360.com or find us on social media. Janina Fisher, Dr. Janina Fisher, welcome to the MindHealth360 Show. I'm so happy to have you here. You are a legend in your field, you're a giant in your field, and it's such a blessing to have you here. So thank you for being with us.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Janina. So Janina, I will just read out your bio. There'll be more information in the show notes, but you know, your reputation precedes you. You are one of the most sort of well-known and followed psychologists in the world, really, with your own incredible trauma treatment approach, which you've developed and which is really groundbreaking in many, many ways, and which we'll talk about. But just to give a little bit of background, you're a licensed clinical psychologist and a former instructor of Harvard Medical School. You're an international expert on the treatment of trauma and an advisory board member of the Trauma Research Foundation. You're the author of 3 books, Healing the Fragmented Selves of Trauma Survivors, Overcoming Self-Alienation, which was written in 2017 or published then, Transforming the Living Legacy of Trauma, a workbook for survivors and therapists, 2021, and the Living Legacy Instructional Flip Chart in 2022. You're best known for your work on integrating mindfulness-based interventions into trauma treatment, and you're also the creator of Trauma-Informed Stabilization Treatment, or TIST therapy. You've been taught by or worked alongside giants in the field of psychological trauma, such as first Judith Herman, then Bessel van der Kolk, and most recently Pat Ogden. One of the things that I've always loved about you is you combine the sort of brilliant intellect and compassionate heart in your work. And so your work, from what I can see, is incredibly scientific and very science-based, but also very warm and compassionate and human and kind. And you really brilliantly marry these two aspects of your approach to trauma, which I think is very unique in what you do. And you know, I've seen you at work. I think you're totally brilliant. You've had fantastic results. And the other thing I love about you, Janina, is that you have this incredible heart, and I know that you do a lot to help those who are disenfranchised, who can't afford treatment, and you know, you have this whole program for people who are, you know, find it hard to access treatment, and you work with people who, you know, are very disenfranchised by society, and I hats off for that. So welcome. One of the things that I'm fascinated by is the neurobiology of trauma and the neurobiological revolution in psychotherapy, which really was, I think you would say, was led by Pat Ogden and Bessel van der Kolk.
By Bessel van der Kolk.
Van der Kolk.
He really was the first, and for a long time, the only person who actually tried to get scientific research on trauma to occur.
Exactly. And he's done some very interesting scientific research. So tell me in a nutshell, like, what is the neurobiological revolution to trauma? Like, you know, we went, I know, from being very cognitive in our approaches and very sort of Freudian and looking at, talk therapy and narratives, to being very body-based and very somatic, and realizing that, the trauma was not in the events that were happening or in the narrative about the events, but actually in the responses of the body. Is that the sort of revolution?
Right. And it's actually a little worse because when trauma survivors told their stories, which in Freud's talking therapy approach was supposed to release the trauma and free them, they got worse.
Interesting.
And when Bessel began to look at what makes them worse, why are they getting worse, he discovered that it was their bodies and nervous systems that were perpetuating the trauma responses. They didn't need to tell the story of the events because all day long their bodies were responding to the environment as if it were unsafe.
Interesting.
And certainly not with any intention or enjoyment on their part. It makes people feel they're losing their minds. Because their bodies respond so strongly to the littlest things.
And so is this about, so you talk a lot about implicit memory, and then you talk about the animal responses that happen with these implicit memories. And so it's almost like people are living, in the present, but in the past. And so they're responding to implicit memories that they're not aware of necessarily, and then their body goes into these animalistic mammalian or reptilian responses, which are fight, flight, freeze. So can you tell us a little bit about how this actually works in practice with trauma survivors?
Well, if you think about it, I can't remember who said the brain's first priority is survival, but it makes sense, doesn't it? So of course, we're born already as babies with what's called a negativity bias, which means that we have more cells devoted to scanning for danger than we do for positive experiences. The brain actually processes negative experience quicker.
Interesting.
So if you have an experience that's kind of a mixture of good and bad, as we all have, the brain is going to process the negative elements of that experience and then kind of add the positive. So we might come away saying, well, that sucked, that was terrible, when actually it was 50-50. Now, if we're born with a negativity bias before anything happens, imagine what happens when there is trauma. So then the brain becomes even more sensitized to trauma-related stimuli, to the littlest things, and reacts with implicit memory and alarm and anticipation of what's going to happen next. And it's only recently struck me that in the world at large and in the trauma field, we don't take into account that when people have feelings, as we all do, sometimes those feelings are memories. They're feeling or implicit memories. Sometimes they're a spontaneous reaction to whatever's happening. And sometimes those feelings could be the feeling of part of us. And so it's really interesting because you have a feeling and you say, well, so-and-so or such and such made me feel that way. We don't say, oh, is this a feeling memory? right? It never occurs to us.
That's so true. It's so true. Or is it a feeling memory of a certain part of us, as you say? Because, you know, one of the, this book, this beautiful book, in fact, which is here, Healing the Fragmented Selves of Trauma Survivors, Overcoming Internal Self-Alienation. And I think that title is really beautiful and says so much. So it's all about fragmentation. And so can you explain, so how does trauma and traumatic events fragment the self? And, you know, what does it mean to be self-alienated?
Well, again, this is going to be brain science simplified. So any brain scientists out there should take it with a grain of salt. But we do have this mental ability of dissociation.
Yes.
We come with it. It's used under stress and under traumatic conditions, not because we choose it. We don't flip a switch and say, I'm going to dissociate now. It's a mental ability. The brain pulls it out when it's needed. Used by peak performers. It's not just pathological, right? Because actors, actresses, musicians, peak performers, athletes use it, or their brains use it, to allow them to disconnect from self-doubt, insecurity, critical voices saying, oh, you can't do it, you're going to fail, and allows them to just be in that peak performance zone. So we believe, you can't really study the brains of all babies on the premise that a certain percentage may get traumatized. So we're looking after the fact. And so we presume that the mental ability of dissociation gets overused because little children don't have many ways of coping.
So just to recap, so basically what you're saying is the fragmentation and the dissociation are the same thing. So basically little children, they often can't fight back, they can't flee, and so they dissociate. Is that correct?
Right. And of course, the younger they are, think of little babies, the less they have ways of coping or surviving. But even a baby can dissociate. Yeah. And also, again, thinking of a young person, if from a very early age, the world and your parents, the people you rely on, are overwhelming and terrifying, there's no way for any kind of positive sense of self to develop.
Yeah.
And in fact, we know from the anecdotes of trauma survivors that many people have the experience of floating up to the ceiling and watching what's happening to that bad child who is getting abused or traumatized. And so that's self-alienation. There's the bad one. She's getting a really, really terrible, terrible traumatic abuse. And then there's the one who watches and says, well, I'm not bad because I'm not a part of that.
Interesting.
And that helps children to survive and adapt.
Yeah.
So they can go to school and they can play with their friends and they can be normal children.
And so the fragmentation or the dissociation is an attempt to survive in these terrible circumstances. Now, what if you don't identify with the bad child? What if you just identify with the scared child or the child who is, so one of the things I struggle with is, what is abuse?
Right.
And you have very obvious, terrible abuse, but then it's all on a spectrum, right? And then you have and I know there's a tendency in trauma survivors to say, well, it wasn't that bad, you know, or to not remember how bad it was, or to minimize it. But then when you talk about the negativity bias of the brain, you also think, well, you know, because I sometimes think, well, am I exaggerating? Like, am I focusing too much on the negatives? But, you know, when you talk about the bad child, is it also that you dissociate? I mean, just to give an example, I mean, to talk about myself for a minute, but I had a very overwhelming, traumatizing mother who herself had a lot of trauma. And the way I dissociated, I would space out. But it was just a form of protection. And it wasn't that, you know, she was beating me up. I mean, she did that occasionally, but not often. But it was more just to protect myself from the energy of anger or grief or volatility that she was, you know, treating her whole life
Which
with.
is very, very scary for children.
Right.
Because the child, the 3-year-old, doesn't know, oh, I'm not going to be killed. I'm going to survive.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
In the moment, it feels like life is ending.
Yes, totally.
And, you know, I always say there are 2 core fears in trauma. And I think you've described both. One is the fear of being attacked and annihilated.
Yeah.
And the other is the fear of abandonment.
Yeah.
So when you have both of those, that's traumatic. It's different from your mother is angry, rejecting, difficult, and you feel hurt.
Yeah.
And unseen.
Yeah.
Not to say that can't go alongside the core fears.
Yeah.
But there are childhoods that are emotionally distressing without causing fear of abandonment or attack. But really what you're describing is what we call the frightening and frightened parent.
Yes, and 100%. Right. And in some ways, you know, because it's so unpredictable, 1 minute the parent is terrified,
right,
and the next minute the parent is
terrifying.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And so, you know, when I think about it for myself, I don't think of myself as the bad child, but I do think of myself as the terrified child who was trying to get it right and trying to be perfect, because that was the way and trying to look after my mother so that she would be okay, so that you know, I wouldn't be in the state of terror or be attacked. And so that's very interesting. So the dissociation, and then how does this relate to dissociative disorders? I mean, is that just an extreme version of this dissociation or fragmentation?
Well, nobody's quite sure. I think we all are fragmented to some degree, but trauma causes our fragments to polarize and to become more extreme, more vigilant, more sensitive to the environment.
Yeah, absolutely.
And, you know, and that brings up another really important point. The trauma field, having focused on events, you know, talk about what happened to you and it will set you free, didn't really comprehend what we now know, which is that the trauma in most cases is not about a series of events. It's about a whole environment from which there's no escape for children.
Completely.
Right? So I always say children are prisoners of war until they're old enough to leave.
Completely.
Yeah, and so that means that your brain and your body have to be anticipating constantly that what's going to happen next.
Completely. And so it's very interesting, because another thing you mentioned in your book is you talk about the different reactions to this traumatic environment and to being stuck. And you talk about either sort of to use polyvagal terms, sort of the dorsal shutdown, so the sort of freeze response. And you also talk about which is part of the parasympathetic system, and then you talk about the hyperarousal and the fight-flight. And so I'm just curious, like you say that, if you're in a state of chronic hypervigilance and in a state of chronic danger in your home life, this often leads to the sort of shutdown, the freeze response, the depressive, low energy, because children can't go anywhere, they can't fight, they can't flee.
Right. And they don't want to make waves because the volatile parent is going to react probably not in the best way. Exactly.
But then what about the flip side of that, which is the sympathetic response? So, children who are hypervigilant, who are hyper-aroused, who are, in some ways just hyper, and who are constantly sort of in fight-flight mode. What determines the difference between these two states? How do you determine which state a child will go to in presence of these sort of dangerous circumstances?
I mean, we think, and this is part of polyvagal theory as well as sort of the neurobiological way of understanding trauma, that it all depends on the environment. So if, I have a client whose environment was chronically dangerous. It was dangerous in the home, it was dangerous outside the home, it was dangerous at school, it was dangerous at the doctor's office. Everywhere there was danger.
Wow.
That really calls for sympathetic responses. And let's not forget that fear is a sympathetic response, not just fight, and also crying for help, which often is not safe to do. I mean, imagine if you had gone to your teachers to say, this is what's happening at home. I'm sure your mother would have been none too pleased.
Well, it did actually happen. Interestingly, I was reading her diaries the other day, and she was describing an episode where I'd gone to school and complained about being terrified or something, and she was irate and furious, and she went in and got really angry with the teachers. So that was
Right. So that did not enhance your safety.
No, definitely not.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. So children adapt.
Yeah.
So they learn, okay, better not cry for help. Certainly better not fight. Right? How can I run? And then you have the fear response, which as a sympathetic response, again, is very adaptive.
Completely.
But it may not be compatible with having to be submissive for years and years, as a prisoner of war has to be.
Interesting. And so this sort of neurobiological revolution, because, we've gone from the sort of, so in England, the NICE guidelines, which are the clinical guidelines of how to treat mental health issues, talk about CBT and cognitive behavioral therapy. And I don't know what it's like in America, but I think it's similar. The sort of CBT has some very good research behind it. But in terms of dealing with trauma and the sort of neurobiological aspects, it's not great, because essentially what you explain in your book very eloquently is the sort of three brains. So you have your prefrontal cortex, and then you have your mammalian brain, your limbic system, and then you have your reptilian brain. And you explain the sort of neurobiology of how it works and how threat, activates the amygdala and then activates the limbic system and then, shuts down the prefrontal cortex, so that you can't actually really, first of all, your traumatic memories are not in your prefrontal cortex. They're not in your sort of thinking brain. They're in your limbic system and in your body, essentially. And so would you say, if you look at currently at the model of treatment of trauma, I mean, would you say that this is revolutionized trauma treatment, and that we're much, much better now at dealing with it, and that the way that we've come up with working with trauma is much more successful than these cognitive approaches.
Well, you know, I wish I could say that, but in many countries, including the UK, there are these very strict guidelines that only quote-unquote evidence-based treatments can be used. Unfortunately, CBT exposure treatment, where the individual has to relive and relive and relive and relive and relive and relive the story of one event until it no longer is activating. There's a very good research evidence base for that treatment, but it's based on studying subjects who have never been suicidal. They've never had an addiction. They've never been in hospital. They've never had other, what we call dual diagnoses. They're not a risk to themselves or anyone else. So you're basically studying the well-traumatized individual. The well-traumatized individual can show, the research results show, oh, look, now this individual can talk about the story of one episode without becoming overwhelmed or shutting down. So that's great. Well, what about the people who had day in, day out danger? People who had hundreds of events, right? I have a client who was taken for exposure treatment when she was 18. She says, it was worse than any of the things that happened to me.
Wow.
Because she couldn't turn away, right? The instruction was, you keep going back to the beginning of the story and you tell it again, and you feel like you're going to die, and then you tell it again. One event out of 50, 100.
Yeah, I mean, that's just crazy. And so, okay, so your approach, which is this trauma-informed stabilization treatment therapy, which I think you coined that term because you were trying to get it funded in hospital and it was more acceptable.
Right.
That's what I remember you saying.
It couldn't be called self-alienation treatment or, God forbid, fragmented selves treatment, and get it approved by the budgeteers.
Exactly, which is, so it's based from what I can see, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you look at sensory motor psychotherapy, you look at parts therapy, so internal family systems therapy, Dick Schwartz, and mindfulness-based therapy and clinical hypnosis. And it's sort of, you've combined these four approaches to develop your own approach. Can you tell us a little bit about how you've done this and what are the key elements of this?
Well, the trauma field started off with people borrowing and stealing ideas and techniques and methods, trying to figure out what did work for trauma, since it was clear that the talking cure was not going to cure trauma.
Yeah.
And so this idea of you integrate whatever works for people is really, that's the very intellectual, very scientific basis for this model, was looking at what worked and what could be tolerated by very, very severely traumatized individuals, and help them to go on with their lives.
And so if you look at the parts, so one of the things I really love about this approach is, I mean, I think internal family systems is great. And so what you do is you look at, you have a really beautiful, you have a few beautiful quotes here. I mean, first of all, you say, I believe the key to healing is not just knowing what happened, but transforming how the mind, body, and soul still remember it. So it's about transforming the memories. And also the way you incorporate IFS and internal family systems is you look at the different parts. And it's about developing self-compassion for these parts. And basically, you know, I think so many of trauma survivors have a lot of self-hatred and sort of, I think, what you would call self-alienation, but essentially sort of a sense of shame and a disavowing of themselves.
Right.
And so you have this very beautiful quote that I need to find, which talks about how, you know, integrating these different parts and looking at them with self-compassion is the key to healing. Would you say, I mean, is that sort of the key takeaway for you from this parts work? How would you explain that?
Yes, because I had this idea that traumatic attachment not only causes ruptures in our relationships with our attachment figures, it also causes a rupture in our relationship to ourselves.
Yes.
So if from a very early age you have to deny or disown the part of you that wants your parents to love you, or the part of you that needs a hug or a little minute of comfort or some reassurance, if you have to disown your anger, you know, like you, I'm a mother, so I'm very accustomed to the fact that children don't do very well hiding their feelings.
Right.
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 So if they're upset, if they're angry, if they're sad, you see it.
Yeah.
And in order to not show it, children can't feel it because they'll give it away.
Interesting.
And with frightening parents, you don't want to give away anything that might evoke the next terrifying outburst.
Yeah.
So this fragmenting and disowning of the child who's angry, the child who's treated as if they had no value, that disowning helps us to be whatever is safest in that world.
Yeah, totally.
Which is usually some variation on compliance and submission.
And so these different parts essentially that we disown, so the child will disown the angry part, or they'll disown the frightened part,
Mm-hmm.
will they then focus on sort of developing the perfectionist or the good child or the, you know, overachiever, the people pleaser, the helper, or those the parts that they then major on?
Well, you know, they don't have to do it intentionally.
Okay.
Because it's instinctive.
Okay.
That's also part of our mental health thinking. We tend to, I think, sort of give ourselves a little aggrandizement in the form of thinking that we do things intentionally, right? We're mammals, so a lot of what we do is instinctive. It's not intentional.
Yeah.
So
and it's adaptive.
It's adaptive, right. So you don't think as a little child, well, I've got to be perfect. You just find it's a little safer if it's perfect. You know, it's a little safer if you're quieter. It's a little safer if you are very sweet and nurturing to your frightening parent. It's not so intentional. So then you kind of have to have a part of you that does that because at the same time, when parents frighten us, we're hurt, we're angry, we're scared, but we can't show it because that triggers the frightening parent. We feel shame. All those feelings have to be somehow compartmentalized and hidden.
Yes.
All without our doing it intentionally.
Yeah. It's instinctive.
Yeah. Any more than the athlete who's just had a terrible life tragedy intentionally doesn't think about the life tragedy and goes out and wins the game.
Yeah.
That's all thanks to this mental ability of dissociation that we don't have to use intentionally.
That's so interesting. So really, I mean, you know, when I look at your work and all this, we're really creatures of extreme survival.
Right.
And we will do whatever it takes. And so, you know, you always have that philosophical debate, are humans good or are they evil? You know, but ultimately we're neither. We're whatever it takes to survive. And so we'll be good if we have to be good to survive, and we'll be bad if we have to be bad to survive. Would you say that's...
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that actually says it beautifully. And it's something that we don't want to think about.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? Because we want to think, even though this abuse and trauma were terrible, it didn't call for having to be vicious and aggressive to survive.
Yeah.
When in fact it often does.
Yeah. Completely. And so in some ways, you know, our traumatic past or traumatic events or our traumatic relationships really then determine, you know, who we are as people, who we are in the world, who we are in relationships. I mean, it's sort of the bedrock of how we then present to the world. And what I'm also very interested in is this idea that trauma rewires your nervous system, and that when you have trauma as a child, you then have your system is essentially rewired to then deal with threats or experiences differently.
Right.
And so really, you know, these traumatic events or relationships just shape us so fundamentally.
Right. Right. Because if your nervous system is traumatized, because it had to be, right? Now we are grown-ups, we're safe, but that nervous system still responds as if the world were dangerous.
Yeah, and so there's a real disconnect between your present and your past. And one of the things I love about your mindfulness approach is that it's about trying to be aware of what's in the present. And so, you know, in Buddhism, you know, we meditate in order to be in the present moment. But in your approach, it's also about being in the present moment with whatever is happening, as opposed to living in this past with your trauma.
Right. And it's what I call everyday mindfulness, which is, you know, which is practiced in Buddhist communities. You're not just mindful when you meditate, you're mindful in how you go about the day-to-day experience of living.
Yeah.
And so, and the interesting thing is, this is, to me, this is so exciting. The medial prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain involved in meditation, when that medial prefrontal cortex is more active, the amygdala reduces its activity. So that everyday mindfulness, whether or not the individual meditates or not, everyday mindfulness contributes to beginning to recalibrate the nervous system.
Interesting.
Which I think is just
phenomenal.
So phenomenal, yes.
And I mean, they've done all this research on meditators and how it increases gray matter in the brain and how it increases, you know, your hippocampus, and it, you know, there are real neurological changes in the brain that come from this sort of mindfulness approach. And I think that what you're saying is also, you know, because of these physiological changes that happen to the nervous system, which then gets primed for sympathetic arousal or dorsal shutdown due to the traumatic events in the past, we then have to really retrain it in some sense to then deal with present day threats in a way that's different. I mean, what are your, how would you advise that people go about doing that? You know, sort of, how do you retrain your nervous system so that it doesn't overreact or underreact? And that's a big question, obviously.
I mean, that unfortunately takes repetition and practice, which is very bad news for people who would like to feel better immediately, if not sooner. But, you know, what I find, especially for dorsal shutdown, is that the best way to go about recalibrating the nervous system is to be interested in the shutdown. It's connected to this Buddhist idea. You notice with interest and without attachment or aversion. Yeah. So we don't reject the shutdown, which, by the way, many therapists do. The clients and survivors, not so much. Or often, I think the sympathetic hyperarousal becomes so overwhelming and exhausting. Yeah. You pump a lot of adrenaline, and then you come down from the adrenaline, and you're exhausted, and your nerves are irritable.
Totally.
So helping people to be interested so that they can begin to make choices.
Yeah.
And and so I love to invite people to be curious about the shutdown and to be curious how it helped them to survive, and to thank it and admire it, and again, it's driving the therapist crazy, but it may not be driving the individual crazy. And to the extent that it is, we can't push a dorsal vagal state into feeling and into joy and excitement, because, we're mammals, and if that state is associated with survival and safety, of course it's not going to just turn on.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So it's almost like a practice, almost like a meditation practice, a daily practice of sort of putting that distance between you and your reaction. And, I think it's Stephen Porges was talking about Viktor Frankl, saying that moment between the stimulus and the response, that space is so important for healing, essentially. Mm-hmm. And so, but depending on how people react, some people react more, they underreact and they go into shutdown. Mm-hmm. Other people go into hyperarousal. I guess there are different ways of approaching these things. And, as a therapist, how would you advise people to sort of do this daily training? Is it working with a therapist? Is it just becoming more mindful? Is it a bit of both? Do you have like a system to advise people on practical ways that they can essentially manage their nervous system on a daily basis more effectively?
And, as much as I admire and am very fond of Steve Porges, the fact is that most of us don't have time between the stimulus and the reaction.
Interesting.
Because that, again, the nature of trauma, the nature of the brain, there's a stimulus and we immediately react. Our bodies, our nervous systems immediately react. We might have a few seconds.
Yeah.
And it takes a lot of practice. And I teach my clients to just keep saying, I'm triggered. That's what's happening. I'm triggered. Because that's about as much as they can do to put a little space in there.
That's actually a great idea, though, to just say, I'm triggered, because that's a great tip.
Yeah.
And, if people were aware that they were triggered, that would make such a huge difference to our society, because how many times do people react and out of clearly being triggered, but they're not aware of it. Mm-hmm. And then there's a cascade of events. But if they could just pause and say, I'm triggered.
Right. And that's that mindful, I'm noticing my state, I'm triggered.
Yeah, completely.
As opposed to what do? We say, this is terrible. How could that person have behaved that way? How could I have embarrassed myself that way?
And we just keep going.
And then we just kind of go down the rabbit hole.
Yeah. So Janina, the other thing I'm always really interested in is the sort of, again, the biochemistry and the neurobiology, and you talk a lot about the two brains, the sort of split brain research, and the left hemisphere, the right hemisphere, and then the corpus callosum, which helps the communication between the two hemispheres.
Right.
How does this play a role in sort of your trauma treatment approach?
Well, this is my take on a theory called the structural dissociation theory, which was proposed by Anno van der Hart, Ellert Nijenhuis, and Kathy Steele, which says, and it's true, that the fault lines for dissociation already lie within the brain. Because even though we call it the brain, it's made up of many, many structures, ranging from tiny to larger, that have different functions, and really rely on communication with each other.
Yeah.
The biggest structural split is between the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. And when I began to look at that split, I began to see, the literature says that the right brain is dominant in early childhood because we don't have language, and we have to rely on gut instinct, on emotion, on sort of reading of body language and facial expression, and sort of gut feeling.
Yeah.
And we all know, those first 5 years, children are kind of a mess of emotion in both wonderful and sometimes stressful ways. And then as they develop language, as their left brains begin to organize, they become capable of more rational thought. I mean, there's such a wonderful age at which you try to reason with your children and then realize that's really not going to work.
Right. It's a waste of time.
Right?
Yeah.
Because the left brain really has to mature quite a bit before children are capable of having a rational discussion that is not intruded upon by those messy feelings of the right brain.
Yeah, completely.
And so I became very interested, thanks to the research of Martin Teicher, in the corpus callosum, which is this thin little strip of a brain structure that makes possible the communication between left and right brains. And I was fascinated to see that the corpus callosum, first of all, doesn't mature until we're over 12, and also is smaller in the brains of traumatized children. So I began to see this pattern. Early childhood, we've got the right brain being emotional. We have the left brain starting to be more verbal and more cognitive, I guess you could say. And then, just at the age when the left brain should be talking to the right brain and helping it to sort things out, we have this, in traumatized children, the split remains.
Interesting.
And so I began to think, this makes sense of the structural dissociation theory. Because the structural dissociation theory says when we're traumatized, a split occurs between what they call the they call it the apparently normal part, and what they call the emotional part. And I could see that just neatly added up to the left brain carries on and is apparently normal, doesn't think it was so bad, and the right brain has the extreme reactions that we would expect to go with extreme events.
That's so interesting. So would you say almost that the trauma is carried or sort of imprinted in the right brain, and that the left brain sort of tries to cope with the, the left brain just tries to carry on in a sort of rational way and make light of it, or just sort of gloss over it, whereas it's imprinted more in the more emotional, intuitive right brain?
Right. I mean, I think the left brain, having not been as impacted, can say it wasn't that bad.
Yeah. That's a good
We
point.
know from that first series of brain scan studies that Bessel conducted that when he looked at the brain scans of, I forget how many, I think 10 traumatized individuals, and he found a consistent pattern when they were reminded of a traumatic event. Interestingly enough, the left brain stopped being active, stopped working, which theoretically is where we remember the events. So they were reminded of the event, the left prefrontal cortex shut down, and the right hemisphere amygdala became hyperactive.
Interesting.
So that really does locate the traumatic memories, the implicit memories, more on the right side.
Right side. And would you say it's the right side, the amygdala, so in the lower brain, as opposed to the higher brain?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that was really the kind of extraordinary finding is, we're trying to treat the left brain. Tell me the story. When the problem is this nonverbal subcortical area of the right brain.
That's exactly right. And from a treatment perspective, then how do you deal with that? Because I mean, our societies are so cognitively driven. Our societies are so left brain driven. And we were just talking about, Professor Ian McGilchrist, who wrote The Master and His Emissaries. And his big beef is with, sort of to summarize it in a nutshell, is that, our societies are too left brain driven. And therefore, we've lost that sort of magical, intuitive, creative aspect of the right brain, and we're too rational. And so, when it comes to treating trauma, how then do you access that right brain? How do you, heal, essentially, when everything in our society, whether it's education or, school therapy, is all geared towards the rational prefrontal cortex of the left hemisphere, I guess?
Well, we have to recruit the left hemisphere to actually pay attention to these signs of implicit memory in the body.
Yeah.
And that's challenging. Not everybody's left hemisphere wants to be recruited, especially when they think, I'm going to have to remember what happened. And so often, I find people do better if I say, you don't have to remember.
Yeah.
It's bad enough what happened. You had no control over that, but you certainly get to choose whether to talk about it or not.
Yeah, completely.
And then I try to teach them that it's the feeling and body memories that are causing the issues for them. It's very rare, in my experience, for people to be troubled by the memories. They're much more often troubled by the feelings that get triggered in everyday life.
That's so interesting. And so, and in order to work with those feelings and sensations, I mean, how do you approach that? So it's true, you're dealing with emotions, you're dealing with body sensations. So how do you encourage people to access those and then heal those?
Well, my point of view is you don't have to access them because everybody's dealing with triggers all day long.
That's true.
So the material's right there. And so what we have to do is pay attention to the triggering rather than to the events. Because triggered feelings are implicit memory.
Yeah.
the feeling memory, body memory.
Yeah.
So that's the beautiful thing, is it can be very natural.
Yeah.
We're not trying to make someone face something that is horrible that they've never faced. They're simply dealing with what already comes up.
Totally. And then so the healing itself, and there's a beautiful passage in your book, which I will read out, but the healing then comes from becoming aware of these triggers and then the feelings and the sensations that they bring about, and then reacting to them as a part from a place of compassion and kindness as opposed to self-judgment, would you say?
Right. Now, getting there is tricky.
Yeah.
Because those habits of self-judgment helped most individuals survive.
Yeah.
So, and asking, I wish we had a group of, 200 trauma survivors. And if I asked them, are you willing to work on having compassion for yourself? We get a universal no
way. Yeah.
Right. So I have to help them appreciate these young parts that help them, and to see them as real children, not as entities, not as a sign of being mad as a hatter, but as the child they once were, or the children they once were. Yeah. And we have to work around the fact that feeling vulnerable is very scary. Mm-hmm. Feeling angry can feel very scary. So depending on the person and the parts, there may be a lot of resistance. Yeah. But usually what I find anyway is that with time and curiosity, and that's what I stress. I don't ask people to feel painful feelings, remember painful things. I just ask them to be curious, which is much easier, but not easy.
Yeah, completely.
Right.
And so, here you say, healing is the outcome of reversing long-standing patterns of self-alienation and building the capacity to love and accept ourselves. When we reclaim our lost souls and wounded children, befriend them, and allow ourselves to trust deeply felt compassionate impulses to reach out to them and build bonds of secure attachment, they feel safe and welcome at long last, and we feel whole. And to me, that's such a beautiful sentence that sort of sums it all up. And it reminds me of, relationships, essentially, whether they're relationships with other people and other people's parts, or with yourself and your own parts. Right. It's all about self-compassion, I guess. Right. And being able to see that sort of vulnerable, wounded child part almost as a separate part that you can feel compassionate towards. Right.
So it really, where this approach relies on the mental abilities that are part of mindfulness, right? So the ability to notice something and notice ourselves noticing it at the same time, which to me is, it changes our whole relationship to painful feelings, to parts of us that we're not so happy with, to say, okay, there's that, and here's me, and I'm just noticing that.
Yeah.
And I try to encourage people to appreciate the ingenuity of their parts rather than the suffering. I think where we go wrong as therapists is we want the client to feel terrible about the suffering of this child. But why is this individual in therapy to feel better? Yeah. And if I help them to notice this child with humor or admiration or wow, that was creative. Those are easy feelings. And then the acceptance grows.
And you make that point really beautifully, in fact, in your book. And you talk a lot about the fact that, part of therapy is to make people feel good feelings, like to feel comfortable and warm and loved and happy,
Right.
rather than focusing on the negative. And that really struck me, because it's true that we spend a lot of our time in therapy talking about the bad things and the bad feelings. But you're saying, no, really experience these moments of peace and of joy and of warmth and of self-love and love of others in therapy, so that you can then take that forward. Is
Right.
that, yeah.
And that's especially important because one of the consequences of trauma for many people is their bodies are averse to feeling positive feelings. Oh. And so it's very easy for negative feelings to last for days, positive feelings to evaporate in 30 seconds.
That's interesting.
And it's very interesting. And I've started to notice, when this person relaxes, all the alarm bells go off.
Yeah, now what do you do about that? Because I experience this a lot. So when I feel relaxed, I panic and I think,
Right.
I have a million things to do, and I get busy again and I keep on the treadmill because it does not feel comfortable to be calm and relaxed. I think I feel guilty that I'm not doing stuff. I feel that, I should be doing something. It is impossible.
Right.
And in fact, my ex-husband always says, you just could never relax, and it was impossible to be around you. So what do you do if that's your reality? How do you then become somebody who can relax? Because it's exhausting.
It is exhausting. It is exhausting. And we talk so much about work-life balance, except if you can't relax, it doesn't matter how good the balance is.
Exactly. And so what's the solution if you're somebody who, for you, feelings of calm or peace or, these feelings of are triggers of danger, essentially? How do you deal with that?
Right. Well, I think, first of all, I would name it as a part. I would say, there's the anti-relaxation part, right? There's the hypervigilant part saying, you relaxed, you were off your guard, you idiot.
Yeah, completely.
Right.
Yeah.
And to see that as, that's like a bodyguard telling you, watch out, watch out. And obviously the bodyguard didn't get the memo that you're in charge of your world now, and you've deliberately chosen a very safe world.
Yeah, completely.
And not to say that there aren't triggers in safe worlds, but there aren't immediate dangers.
Completely. And I think that really is the essence of trauma, essentially, is this disconnection or the discrepancy between what's happening in your present and what you're feeling in your body to react to that present, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And things like, another thing you mentioned in your book, which I thought was fascinating, you were talking about ADHD, borderline, bipolar as being sort of dissociative disorders or comorbid or correlated. And I found that very interesting because ADHD is a huge epidemic in our society. And we were talking about not being able to relax. People with ADHD, they can't focus, they can't sit still, they get very, they have to keep busy, they have to keep moving. And so I was really surprised to see that was a symptom of dissociation or possibly trauma. So what is the link there?
Well, we don't know for sure, but it does seem highly coincidental that we've had this, really tidal wave of ADHD diagnoses in children. And I think what's happening is we're misdiagnosing children with dysregulated and probably traumatized nervous systems, and we're calling them ADHD. And I think and we're medicating them.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is the medications won't work unless the child has biological ADHD, which is why the rate of success using ADHD medication is actually
quite high.
Right.
Right.
I mean, so a lot of children don't have positive effects. Some do.
Yeah.
But many, many, many don't.
So you would say generally ADHD medication doesn't actually work. And
children who have biological ADHD, my older son has a brain just like his father's, who had ADHD, and I can see the genetic, and probably his father's father had the same kind of brain. And so the medications don't work for my son.
Interesting.
Interestingly enough. So it seems to vary with, my son has inattentive ADD rather than hyperactive. Yeah. The medications work best with the hyperactive biological ADHD. They don't help so much with trauma-related ADHD.
And so how can you tell the difference? Because there is such a huge, I know that, both my sons have ADHD, and one is medicated, the other isn't. And the medication does help, but temporarily, and there are a lot of side effects, but he also has trauma. And so, how can you tell the difference? Is it biological? Is it trauma-driven? And what's the solution? I mean...
Right. And especially because, your children's environment, but parents who are frightening and who are traumatizing their child may not be aware of it.
Yeah.
Or they may think it's good parenting.
Yeah, completely.
Spare the rod and spoil the child.
Yeah.
So, it's very difficult. ADHD is a checklist of symptoms. And nowhere in the diagnosis does it say what caused them.
Yeah, completely.
So I think we just have to see how children respond to a safe environment and therapy, if they have therapy, and see if their nervous systems regulate, and then their attention is better.
That's very interesting. So really, a regulated nervous system is the bedrock of attention and focus, and also probably the bedrock of good mental health.
Absolutely.
We talk about depression and anxiety and all these mental health issues, but really I'm coming more and more to the conclusion that they're the result of a dysregulated nervous system.
Right. And the more we learn to regulate our nervous systems, the more we can tolerate feeling anxious or depressed.
That's a good point.
Right? Because God knows we're not going to get through life without ever feeling depression or anxiety.
That's exactly right, Janina. Yeah. You're right. And what are your sort of top tips, and this might be a silly question, but what are your top tips to regulate the nervous system? Because it is so fundamental. And what can we do? And also, I feel so sorry for our children and our teens who are very dysregulated, by their 24/7 phones and social media and crappy food and, all the stimulus that they're bombarded by.
Right, and the 2.5 years of the pandemic, which had such a terrible effect on their learning and their peer relationships.
Completely. And so what would you say are sort of your top tips for regulating the nervous system, whether it's adults or whether it's young people? What would be your advice?
Well, it's harder with teenage children because they may or may not be interested in regulating their nervous systems. But with young children, I think we can teach them. The best way to regulate is to be more mindful. So we can teach children to notice and to name and to be curious, which is great for them anyway. There's nothing, it has no side effects, right? It's a and it's easy to teach because children are naturally curious anyway.
Yeah. So really, it's being naturally curious, observing, naming, and developing this awareness. And so really, a lot of what you're saying is deeply spiritual. I mean, it's these spiritual traditions that have been around for, hundreds of thousands of years.
Right.
It's borrowing essentially from that. And if we can make our societies more in line with these spiritual traditions, we'd all do much better from a mental health perspective.
I know. I think the terrible thing is to realize that it's this dysregulated nervous systems of people in power that are causing so many of the ills around the world.
It's terrifying because, if you do look at people in power who have these very dysregulated nervous systems, it's causing havoc. And just as in your little microcosm, you have one member of a family who's very dysregulated, it really messes up the whole system.
Right.
It's the same with these governments and people in power that just dysregulates the whole system.
Right.
Yeah.
And in the U.S., for example, many people don't feel safe right now because of the political situation.
Well, not only that, we were in Memphis this summer and with my boys, and we walked into this huge shop full of guns. And the guy, and my son is 18, and he said, I can get you out of here in 30 minutes with a gun. And, we were just flabbergasted. And he said, there are 90% of people in this store are carrying a gun. And as a European, I found that quite shocking. And my son actually said, he said, well, if I were living in America, I'd get a gun because it's the only way I would feel safe. And so that's the real problem, is that then, it's a vicious circle where if everybody has guns and everybody then fears for their safety, and then the only way to feel safe is then to get a gun. And it becomes this very vicious circle, and it's a very unsafe feeling environment, which is very dysregulating.
Absolutely. And if you think about the mass shootings in the U.S., for every mass shooting there are eyewitnesses, but there are millions of people who see that, and children, I'm thinking especially, who then feel less safe in the world.
Completely. And then that dysregulates their nervous system. Right. And then that leads to a cascade of effects. One final question, because you've been so generous with your time, but one final question on this sort of cascade of dysregulation is, I'm particularly interested in functional medicine and in integrative medicine and mental health. And I'm interested in, hormones and nutrition and infections and molds and pathogens and inflammation and those effects, those biochemical effects on the brain. And I'm very interested in the body. And I'm very interested in the sort of interaction between your world, which is this, therapeutic approach to treating trauma, and the biochemistry, the sort of biological dysregulation. And what is the relationship between the two in your view?
Well, I think, surviving trauma is in part due to the way our body chemicals try to protect us. So, many individuals become over-reliant on adrenaline. And of course, the number of mental health effects and physical effects of being essentially addicted to one's own adrenaline are scary.
That's a very good point.
Right.
Yeah.
And, something like self-harm, which is a very big issue among traumatized individuals, self-harm triggers adrenaline responses and endorphin responses. So basically it's making use of those body chemicals to get relief.
Interesting.
But then what does that do when your endorphin system is responding to self-harm instead of when your body's not allowing you to feel joy, excitement, and pleasure?
Interesting.
So I'm not a medical doctor or a functional medicine doctor, but I just can't help but think we are depending on body chemicals to survive without thinking about the side effects.
It's a very good point. And any form of addiction or these behaviors that changes your neurochemistry, you know, and are coping mechanisms essentially to try and regulate your neurochemistry to get to a place that feels safer, more pleasant, right? And so you're right. I mean, essentially these behaviors are manipulating your own biochemistry to have a react. I mean, we call them adrenaline junkies, you know, there are different forms of behavior that lead to that. And that's very interesting. And then the other thing is, you know, I've also heard that there's, you know, the mold personality or the Lyme personality. So people who are, susceptible to mold poisoning or to Lyme, to getting bitten by a tick and having a Lyme response. And usually they're people who've suffered trauma.
Wow.
And so trauma apparently primes your system to being more stressed out by these essentially environmental aggressors. And the body doesn't recognize the difference between a psychological trauma and a physiological one. And so it'll mount the same sort of response, whether it's a mold or a pathogen or whether it's psychological trauma. A trigger. Exactly.
Right. Absolutely. Bessel van der Kolk talks about this from time to time, about how the body responds to pathogens as if they were the monster coming to get us.
Exactly. And so then we have an over response, you know, which then might create an autoimmune condition or a chronic inflammatory syndrome, which then, you know, essentially over time degrades the body and the body's homeostatic resilience, essentially. And so I find that very interesting. And then the other thing I was reading was that actually these physiological stressors, so if you grew up in a moldy home or if you were bitten by a tick when you were very young, can then make you more susceptible to psychological aggressors and so to sort of traumatic events or stressors at a later stage, because your body is again primed in this sort of state of fear and sympathetic overdrive, and then has a greater response to psychological triggers. And so it's less resilience. And I guess it's all about homeostatic resilience. It's about how resilient are you, whether they're biochemical stressors or whether they're psychological ones.
Right. And can we treat both?
Exactly. Yes. And so that's where I'm coming from, is I think we really need a reunion of both. We need a reunion of, you know, people like you who work with trauma and phenomenal therapists and psychologists and this whole world of fantastic healers to sort of team up with these functional medicine doctors who deal more with the biochemical side, and to be able to have a really 360-degree approach to treating mental health issues or even physical health issues from this biological and psychological perspective.
Right. It's exciting to think about.
It's exciting to think about, Janina, and I know you get it. And I mean, it is. I mean, that's sort of the holy grail, right? But I mean, you do what you can. And I also, you know, I always have this conversation with Benji, in fact, Benjamin Fry, because I always say, well, he says, well, you know, if you regulate your nervous system, you're so much more resilient to any sort of biochemical aggressors, essentially. And so for him, it all starts with a regulated nervous system. And I think I probably agree with that. Whereas, you know, some functional medicine people will say, well, no, you have to sort of dial up your biochemical resilience and then you can deal with, you know, everything else. And I think as with everything, you can't separate the two.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, Janina, I must say you are such a delight and so wonderful. And I feel like, I mean, have we covered everything? There was one part that I thought was quite interesting, was the concept of earned secure attachment, which was Dan Siegel's concept, which you've adopted. I think before we close, I love that concept of earned secure attachment and how important it is. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how it works in your system?
I mean, it's really such a hopeful concept. It came out of studying adult attachment and seeing there's some people who, believe it or not, had secure attachment as small children, amazing, and have it today with their own children. But there was a subgroup that had very insecure or traumatic attachment as children, but nonetheless had developed secure attachment as adults and were passing it on to their children. And so the general thinking has been, oh, well, okay, you can earn secure attachment with good therapy, good relationships. But I thought, well, why? Relationships are challenging. Therapy is challenging. Why can't we earn secure attachment by learning to attach to ourselves? And so I had this idea of what I call internal attachment, right? There are interpersonal attachments, but what's the quality of our relationship to ourselves, to our young selves? And that if we could find a way to appreciate, become fond of, and even love those little kids inside us, we were creating secure attachment.
I mean, that's very, very beautiful. And I think that's so true. And but it's also quite challenging.
Oh, yes.
But I like that because it makes you less dependent on other people or on your therapist. And but do you first have to have a secure attachment with an attachment figure, whether it's a therapist or whether it's another human, in order to then be able to attach securely to your parts inside?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I mean, again, it never hurts for us to have healthy relationships, but I see it as really an internal process. It could be aided by having healthy relationships in the here and now, but it's not dependent. And that's a wonderful thing.
And so how do you do it? I mean, how do you do it? Do you meditate? Do you talk to yourself? I mean, what's sort of, I guess for each person it's different, but how do you develop a secure attachment to yourself if you don't have one?
Well, I think this is really what TIST is all about. It's seeing all the, what I call distressing feelings, whether it's hurt, anger, sadness, shame, or even discomfort with relaxation. Seeing all of those as communications from parts. So, so that we respond to feeling anxious or feeling shame or feeling depression by saying, oh, this young part of me is really struggling today. And usually when people can say that, first they learn to sort of rotely say, oh, that's a part. But after a while, they begin to see this part begins to take shape into a child. And they can have some empathy for that child, especially if I don't ask them to think of it as themselves, but to think of it as, oh, this is an 11-year-old, and she is so depressed. There's a kind of natural empathy.
Yeah, completely.
And, I think what I always say is, can we put an arm around ourselves? Can we reassure ourselves? Can we forgive ourselves if we make a mistake, put the foot in mouth, say something to our children that we regret later? Right? Can we have this unconditional positive regard, which, as you know, is not easy to do?
It's not easy to do. And, but I think it's especially challenging for people who have suffered trauma and who are often, full of shame or full of self-loathing, and who are very disconnected from themselves. But I do think, it's like a meditation practice. I think, as you were saying earlier, if you do it over and over and over again, and even though it's sort of fake it till you make it, you keep doing it until it feels more natural, maybe.
Right. Right. And I always frame it as, you're just noticing this child is upset, and you're naming it. And that already makes children feel better.
Yeah.
Because there's nothing worse when you're a child than being ignored.
Totally.
Right? So I think that's part of why it works, because people start to feel the positive effects if they just notice, oh, that shame is the child's shame. Yeah. And I'm noticing, I'm listening to this child inside telling me how mortifying it is. And again, some people have parts that want to squish the child parts like a bug, say very, very mean, rejecting things. But most people are actually, when they understand the parts, and I love to ask them, how did this depressed little girl or this depressed little boy help you survive?
Yeah.
And when they put that piece together, usually there's a spontaneous gratitude or empathy.
And that's beautiful, because then, you're in some sense personifying this part, and you're, instead of seeing what they were doing or how they were as pathological, you're seeing it as salvatory.
Right.
Right. And this is essentially what enabled you to survive. And so the gratitude piece is very important.
Right. And this child did not choose to be ashamed. Right. This is not a black mark on that child part. She was shamed. And so she carries that.
Yeah.
And you can either agree with her that she's a worthless whatever, or you can say, I notice you.
Yeah. I see you.
I hear it. Yes, exactly. I see you.
Yeah. That's so beautiful, Janina. I mean, it's very spiritual, your approach. It's very much about sort of gratitude, awareness, consciousness, mindfulness, and then entering into connection with this self.
Right.
Yeah.
And actually, now that you say that, you're helping me to realize that this kind of conviction that I have, that every part was a contributor to survival, to making the best out of the worst.
Completely.
Right? That's really a spiritual idea.
It's a very spiritual idea, and I love that. And,
Yeah.
and it rejoins somewhat, I think, Dick Schwartz's idea of self, which I always see as a very spiritual self. And yes, it's partly left brain and self-leadership, but there's also this sort of the sense of divine and having a sort of almost godlike awareness of the different parts and the different children and the role that they played. And, it requires a sort of perspective that's a little larger than,
Right.
which is important.
Yes.
Well, Janina, I must say you are wonderful, and I'm so grateful. And I have to say your patients are so lucky. Your clients are so lucky to be working with you, and all the people that you train around the world. And I have to say they're very, very lucky to be trained by you and to be treated by you. And so thank you also for being here.
My pleasure. What a delight to have this conversation.
Well, Janina, you were delightful, and I could talk to you for hours. And so thank you.
I guess we better shut up because we could keep going.
Yeah, we'll keep going. Exactly. I know. We'll stop before we make everyone vomit. But anyway, thank you so much, Janina. You're brilliant.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for listening to the MindHealth360 Show. I hope that we've helped you realize that mental health symptoms have root causes that can and need to be addressed in order to sustainably heal, and have given you some ideas about steps you, your loved ones, or clients may take to start their healing journey. Please share this interview with anyone you think may find it helpful, and don't forget to subscribe to keep up to date with our latest interviews on integrative mental health. If you want further information, please go to www.mindhealth360.com or find us on social media. This information is for educational purposes only and is not intended to diagnose or treat any disease or to replace medical advice. Please always consult your healthcare practitioner before discontinuing any medication or implementing any changes in your diet, lifestyle, or supplement program.